So I've got to say to all these people, fellow Australians, about 8 months ago I was sitting in Parliament House in Canberra with Craig Kelly, and both of us were in despair on how the political class and our institutions had deserted the Australian people. We decided to provide leadership with the United Australia Party. Craig provided a political leadership, and I said I could throw in $100 million to give a challenge to Liberal, Labor and Greens coalition, a real challenge in this election. We now have in the United Australia Party 82,000 members right across the country.
Oh, well done.
And that makes us the biggest political institution in Australia. The Liberal Party has about 50,000 members, the Labor Party about 55,000 members. But they've had them a bit longer, they've had a bit more experience than we have, but nevertheless, we've done a good job. You know, COVID vaccine mandates defy international law, are contrary to the Fair Work and Safety Law, and contrary to the health of employees, and defy the industrial and constitutional law of this country. Mandates destroy the standards of industry and the Australian community. The Australian Constitution has no greater purpose than protect and defend our freedom and the nation's security. The Constitution must become the hallmark of freedom. The United Australia Party will propose changes to the Constitution to ensure freedom forever for all Australians. The first matter on the agenda of the United Australia Party is the enactment of an Australian Bill of Rights, which will outlaw lockdowns, protect the right of all Australians to choose medical treatment, and preserve the freedom of speech. I wanted to thank Josh Frydenberg, the Liberals' great treasurer, for the once only $250 payment to deal with the cost of living pressures. Thank you, Josh. I mean, after all, the $250 payment works out at $1.60 a week over the term of the next Parliament, right? If ever Australians were unsure of what the Liberal Party thinks about them, now we know, $1.60 a week. You may think that's not much, but if you compare it to what the Labor Party's offering, it's nothing, right? At least it's a start. We need to tell them they're dreaming. The United Australia Party believes that Australia and Australians can do better, much, much, much better. Liberal so-called full employment at wages and living standards, which have declined in real terms over the last 10 years, is not a success, but stands as a testimony to failure. Failure to deliver a better life for our country, a better standard of living for our children, and better aspirations for our future. If the cost of labour just gets cheaper and cheaper, of course there'll be more jobs. But at what price? The price of our living standards, the price of our community, and what we want to become. And in this country, because of the Liberal-Labor mismanagement, Australia faces $1 trillion of Liberal-Labor debt. It's pretty hard to think it's down there somewhere, one of our notes. So 1 billion million, yeah, so it's unbelievable. When I was in Parliament in 2014 budget, I stood as the last sentry of the gate against Tony Abbott's austerity measures. And then it was about $30 billion that was going to be thrust as further debt on the Australian people. And what a fuss we put about that, and of course, that eventually resulted in Tony Abbott being deposed as Prime Minister. So you imagine $1 trillion of debt, nearly 300 or 400 times that amount, what that can do to our country, right? It's unprecedented in the nation's history. And it's inevitable, with that level of public debt, interest rates will rise, in particular home loan interest rates. Will not only double with the Liberals' mountain of debt, but home loan interest rates will quadruple. Inflation in the United Kingdom is 6.2% today. The United States has just risen to 8.9%. And in Australia, it's currently running at 5%. It's not normal to have home loan interest rates lower than the inflation rate like we did before this election. And we've just seen our rates rise. Currently, 40% of all existing mortgages in our country is under mortgage stress. And when the rates double from 2 to 4% by the end of this year, which they will, 60% of mortgages in this country will fail. When they go up to 6%, 80% of mortgages will fail. So most surely we'll be in a difficult situation where the only people left with any money to buy these mortgages will be foreigners or foreign capital, or the government, who may intervene and say that we can buy your house off you, we can look after you, we can lease it back to you for life, and they'll give you the conditions. You know, who you can invite over, when, how much electricity you can utilise, and they'll make sure that you live your life what the average says it should be. I believe all of us are individuals. This is off the speech now. I believe that all of us are individuals.
I'm not.
Right?
Sorry, not invite them.
Okay, all of us are individuals. All of us have unique potentials. It's not for government to tell us who can succeed and who can fail. It's not for government to tell us what jobs we can do and where we can live. It's for us. It's our life, and we need to be able to decide what our future will be. And every person, every individual, every Australian needs to have their life valued. That we're not all the same. We don't come from a communist country. We've got different views, different skin colours, different builds, different cultural backgrounds. And Malcolm Fraser was a good friend of mine, and he believed in diversity in our country and strength, and that was what became with multiculturalism in Australia. That all of us could come from many lands, but we all believed in the Commonwealth of Australia and the friendship and the life and the lucky country that we had here. What stands at stake in this election and in future elections is the very freedom that we've come to cherish as Australians, the very hopes of generations, the dreams of the Anzacs who protected and defended this country. When Australians lose their homes, of course, of increased home loan rates, nothing will stop, as I said, foreign buyers from buying. I'm back on the speech now. The property market will crash, as I said. So, because of Liberal Labor's debt, Australians will become economic slaves in their own land. Save Australia we must. Save Australia we will. Save Australian homes and save Australian families. Australia must act now to save Australian homes, to save the country's economy, and to protect our freedom and independence. The national crisis is that we must preserve home and the wealth of each and every Australian family and individual. Home ownership has been the cornerstone of our lives, when you think about it, for the last 70 years. And much of that time we had the highest home owning rates in the world. That every man could have his castle. It was a great movie, The Castle, wasn't it? And everyone could live their life as they wanted to live it. And these are the fundamental things about Australians. They could all aspire to have their own independence and their own freedom. And that's what they want to snuff out in our country. Australians can never trust the Liberal, Labor or Green Party ever again, right? We can never trust the political class which has sold out our country. Under Craig Kelly's leadership, the United Australia Party will reassert the government's control it has under the Constitution for the benefit of all Australians. Under Section 51(13) of the Constitution, the Australian government has the power to control banking in this country. And up until the 1990s, the Australian government always set the level of home owned interest rates. That power was given by an Act of Parliament to the Australian, to the RBA. And it only requires an Act of Parliament to amend it. By requiring that interest rates for housing loans be below 3% per annum for the next 5 years, we will ensure that all Australians own their own home and are protected. Because not only do they need to own their own home, if you lose your home, it damages our social fabric. It damages our self-image. It leads to family breakups, stress, affects our children with our education. So this is a pre-eminent crisis in our country which is coming. But the Liberal Party won't tell you about it. The Labor Party won't tell you about it because they don't know what to do with it, now or long term. Only the United Australia Party can ensure that home loan interest rates remain below 3%. Australians must vote for the United Australia Party and save their home and their family's wealth. We now know that freedom is the real target, is home ownership and independence. All through the pandemic, while we were worrying about mandatory vaccinations and the terrible things that were happening, and they were terrible. We can talk about that later. But while we were doing that, the government was recklessly running up over $1 trillion of debt in this economy and setting us up for their real goal and that was to take your wealth from you to put you under further government control and lockdown. And it's very, very hard when you look at the serious issues of the vaccine and the mandates to keep a cool head and to identify what's going to happen next. And it is happening next. And there's a much bigger agenda afoot in the world than you think there is. If you look at the people from Switzerland, the Economic Forum, they've told you that you'll own nothing, but you'll be happy. You know? When they say you'll own nothing, it means they take from you your rights for expression, your rights of speech, your rights to hug your partner, your rights to live together. When I visited China as a small boy back in the mid-1960s, I often had the wife living in northern China and the husband in southern China, and families were separated. And they'd broken down the family unit, that the love and the things that bind us together as human beings. So all of these things is this agenda that government wants to take from us our freedom. And no government ever wants to give back your freedom once they've taken it. You only get it back if the people demand it. And that's what we're here for today, to demand our independence and our freedom back. The government can't take your freedom. They haven't given it to you. Around this globe, the graves of 100,000 young Australians dot the globe who have given you your freedom. They've given you your freedom in places like Gallipoli, Beersheba, the Western Front, the South Pacific, Yip, Tobruk, Normandy, Kokoda, Milne Bay, the Coral Sea, Vietnam, China and Korea. And they're the people that have put their lives and lost their lives because to them, your freedom mattered. So the trumpet sounds again in 2022 to a new generation of Australians to meet the challenges that bring. Someone can turn it off because I can't read my speech. For the challenges that we have. And that call is being answered by the 80,000 Australians that have joined our party. And 151 candidates are contesting this election. And it's a call that needs to be answered by 23 million Australians. Though the time is short and the task is great, we cannot hesitate to stand up for freedom. No task is too great. No sacrifice is too much for every individual to protect their country, to protect their own freedom, and to protect our fellow citizens. So we are fortunate that history has called upon us and this group of people to bind together to protect our country. Current projections are that it'll take 180 years to repay the mountain of debt that Josh Frydenberg and the Liberals have given to you. Frydenberg says that we won't even start repaying the debt for 10 years. That's after he's left Parliament. He doesn't care, really, right? The United Australia Party will deal with the Liberals' $1 trillion of debt, mountain of debt now head on by implementing measures designed to protect the Australian economy from the impact of the political class of Liberal and Labours and the $1 trillion of debt. Australian iron ore is supplying the boom in manufacturing in Asia, upon which the economies of Japan, Korea, China and the rest of Asia depend. There's over $55 trillion of investment in Asia in manufacturing plant and equipment, and that relies primarily on the supply of Australian iron ore. Australia supplies 75% of that market. The supply chain and prosperity of all the people of Asia, as well as their exports to the United States and Europe, are linked irrevocably with the supply of iron ore from our country. Australia has become the quarry upon which Asia bases its prosperity. In the 1960s, under Prime Minister Bob Menzies, the Australian government had an export licence for our iron ore. The United Australia Party will reintroduce a 15% export licence for all iron ore exports from this country, and will pledge the proceeds from such licence to be used solely for the retirement of the $1 trillion of debt, which it will retire in a period of 20 years, thereby bringing our budget back to balance and alleviating the Australian people from the problem which we're now facing. And by doing that, we can open up and we can do more for our country and provide more cash and more services which people need, and we can turbocharge it. With a cap on bank home lending rates below 3% for the next 5 years, the United Party will save 6 million Australian homes which will otherwise fail, and will protect the freedom of Australian families and the independence of our country. We cannot allow our whole country to be dispossessed just because the Labor and Liberal parties recklessly ran up the debt. You know, Australian superannuation is among one of the largest pools of capital in the world. Just as John Curtin, as our Prime Minister in the Second World War, brought back Australian soldiers to protect and defend our country in World War II, we'll bring back $1 trillion of superannuation invested in shares in North America and Europe, and mandate by law that they must be invested in our country to develop our nation, not the United States or not the UK. So when you look at that synopsis of those three policies, and there's more to talk to you about, but you realise that we've saved people's homes, we've dealt with the $1 trillion of debt we've had, and we've brought back $1 trillion more capital that can be invested in our nation to provide growth and infrastructure and jobs and more jobs for our people. So they're three major policies. You haven't heard that from poor old Albanese. You haven't heard anything much from Albanese. And you haven't heard it from Scott Morrison. It was interesting to see this morning a journalist say, we all know that Albanese is not very convincing. He said he's not he can't do very much. Like, you can understand why they'd say that about poor old Albo. But he said, but Scott Morrison, you know he's telling you bullshit, but he tells it much better.
Albo's a terrible actor.
He is. I don't think he's acting though, right? You know, one of our policies at this election is that we will make the first $30,000 that you spend on your housing loan tax deductible, and thereby opening up the home ownership and tax ability to buy houses for so many young people in this country. One of our long-standing policies of the United Australia Party has been the abolition of the structure of provisional tax in this country, where businesses have to pay their tax in advance before they've made a profit. They've got no capital to employ people. And you know, the Australian government is the largest petitioner of bankruptcies in Australia. You know, it's the Australian government, by requiring taxes be paid in advance by small businesses, that place all these small businesses in jeopardy. Then people lose their jobs, they lose hope for the future, it costs us more money in Centrelink, and we get family distress and problems with the National Disability Scheme. A lot of hurt is being happening by people because our politicians either don't care or are not capable to look at basic things. By making changes to ensure that business pays its tax after it's made a profit rather than before it's made a profit, we'll release $90 billion more each year into the Australian economy. And every time that $90 billion turns over, the government gets 10% GST on it. And it should turn over 5 times a year. That gives us $45 billion more revenue. And that means that we can provide that money to improve our hospitals and our schools, which are sadly lacking. Because the United Australia Party has dealt with Labor Liberals' debt, we can make other initiatives. I've already told you about the home loans, I'll tell you something else. The United Australia Party will also reduce the taxation rate that a person pays on their second job, giving all Australians an incentive and providing government with increased revenue which will not be paid if a person did not have a second job. At the moment, you know about the labour crisis we've got in this country, and part of the reason is because of our progressive taxation. So the more you earn, the larger proportion you pay in tax. So by removing this requirement, the government will still get more tax than they would have otherwise got, but you, as individuals, will have the proper incentive to have a second job, as you would have in most other countries of the world. And our senior citizens are paid less than others relying on government support. We must change this as a priority. The first step that the United Australia government will take is to increase the pension for retirees by extra $180 a fortnight.
Yes.
Our healthcare is declining every year in Australia. We cannot desert the sick and dying. Our hospital staff are overworked, and the capital infrastructure is not up to the projected increase in demand. Despite the extra $1 trillion, the government has borrowed nothing to be spent on hospitals or on investing in healthcare for our people. Yet this was supposed to be a pandemic when more problems were happening in health, where people would be given some sort of support. In government, the United Australia Party has pledged to make $40 billion available directly to hospitals in this country, not via state governments, but straight to hospitals to provide for increased support for our people. We need to provide more funding for education in Australia. A free nation can rise no higher than the standard of excellence set in the schools and colleges. Ignorance and illiteracy, unskilled workers, school dropouts are failures of our education system. In the past, this has bred failures of our social and economic systems and delinquency. Unemployment and chronic dependency is a waste of human resources and a loss of productivity, and increased in tax supported benefits only takes from the nation. The United Australia Party will inject an extra $20 billion in the education system in our country in the first 3 years of government. It's time to invest in Australians and the next generation, and we can only do that because we're dealing with the debt and we've got the funds available to do it with our total economic plan. If we don't have confidence in ourselves, who will have confidence with us? We have to make our future in this country for Australians. We must educate our children as our most valuable resource. We must make it possible. We must make it possible for those with talent to go to university, but we must also ensure that those who are educated can find a job after graduating from university. Because our policy is to pay back debt, the United Australia Party will forgive and remove all HEX fees currently applying in Australia. More importantly, we must protect Australia. A hostile nuclear-powered submarine between Singapore and Perth would cut Australia off from its oil supplies, and this nation would close in 60 days. The United States government has offered Australia, but they won't tell you, access to Los Angeles-class nuclear submarines available now at a fraction of the cost of which you would pay for the ones they've talked about in 40 years' time. But of course, that deal doesn't involve lobbyists, doesn't involve middlemen, and it doesn't make a lot of money for a lot of people. It just provides good security and defence for the nation. So we won't be backward in suggesting that's what happened. We must also encourage Australians to buy Australian produce, and the labelling and packaging regime needs to be changed so that Australians know exactly what products are Australian. So that Australians can make a choice to support Australian products and Australian jobs and Australian industry. If the product contained in any package or container is not at least 95% Australian, then the product will not have the green and gold classification and labelled Australian. Anything less should have a red label and be marked as foreign. You know, the Liberal and Labor Party are full of lobbyists. Right? The United Australia believes that lobbyists should be excluded from holding official positions in all political parties. You know, lobbyist firms often employ former ministers from both sides of the political spectrum, and big business can get policy changes by paying money to such firms to represent their views. It's a lot cheaper to do that than spend $100 million on an election, I can tell you that. This represents a serious conflict of interest and undermines the democracy that all Australians fought for in our history. When the Anzacs went overseas, they didn't go overseas as members of the Liberal Party or members of the Labor Party. They went as Australians. We need to put the idea of a class war behind us and unite our nation, to provide the solutions to the issues facing our great country, to stand with our fellow citizens at this important time of our nation's history is for all of us and everyone in this room a great honour. Together we can make a difference. We can save Australian homes. We will ensure, as I said, that interest rates for home loans are below 3% for the next 5 years. We will ensure that the customers of Australian iron ore pay an extra 15% for an export licence and eliminate Australia's mountain of debt and save Australia's AAA credit rating. The United Australia Party is going to turbocharge the economy by bringing back to Australia $1 trillion of Australian super, currently invested in North America and Europe. $1 trillion will ensure Australia has the funds to invest further and to create productive jobs and increase living standards. One of the other things that we're doing with that policy, which isn't in this speech, but I'll tell you about, is that we've got a policy to process our minerals in this country. Presently, we export different ores and different minerals from between $20 to $200 a tonne to Asia. And places like Japan and Korea process those minerals and export them for $20,000 a tonne, right? Yet Japan, for instance, suffers from the tyranny of distance, has higher wages than we have, and has got to pay a higher energy cost. So we're really saying to our country that we can't do it. We can't take advantage of our resources. And we're giving those opportunities every year to other countries. That's why wages haven't increased. That's why living standards haven't got better. The Liberal and Labor governments have done their absolute best to build fear over the last 2 years. They have shut down every single voice which is provided as an alternative point of view to their narrative. They have silenced hundreds of doctors. They have silenced academics. They've silenced Australians who have dared to ask questions and demand answers. The right to ask questions is a fundamental to a free and an open society, but we have been denied that right by the fake media, by the politicians. History shows us that segregation such as mandatory vaccination is evil. It shows us that we must reject authoritarianism and instead pursue a more democratic and inclusive society. Recent history is full of examples of what an elected government can do when it becomes emboldened with too much power. Governments love to use a crisis, whether real or imagined, to give themselves more power. When they seek to subvert the democratic process because they tell the people that it's for their safety, it's for their protection, we know what the usual outcome is. And the usual outcome is tyranny. The Australian government must bring rogue states into line. It's the Liberal and Labor's interest to create fear and create division. A divided society is easy to control. While people are busily fighting among each other, the Liberal Party and Labor Party want to be left free to control us unabated and unchecked. Labor and the Liberals have already caused too much damage to Australia with their $1 trillion debt and the countless deaths we've seen in this country. If you believe, as I do, that this nation has the strength and the potential to live out its heritage, to fulfil the dreams of the Anzacs, to return Australia to being a lucky country, it should be you. And you must give your support to the United Australia Party. Australians can make a difference. Together we will stand up. Together we'll create a change. Together we'll make a better tomorrow. Freedom forever.
Yes.
So I've got to give that speech next week, so I haven't learned enough.